Meet you. Wish it was in person, but grateful to have you here and welcome to the council and the work of this subcommittee.
Thank you.
There's going to be a lot to digest over the coming weeks, but hopefully you can engage and help us work through some of these initial concepts and actions we've been working on and help make them better.
I'm happy to help wherever I can, and have spent some time reading some of the documents that your committee and the council has produced over the last 10 months, and have more yet to read.
All right, then. Our first order of business is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which we normally do by consensus unless someone raises an objection. We good to go with those minutes? All right, let's deem them approved and launch right into the presentations from task leads on the strategies and action steps that we're going to present to the council at the next council meeting. And I think, Peter, you're first up. I don't have the agenda in front.
Yep. We are the non-energy sector is happy to go first. Appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to have to be on the road for part of the meeting, and so wanted the opportunity to go first so I could do this in person before I got on the road. So I'm going to pull up our spreadsheet in a moment, but just to sort of ground you again, before we get into the details, in the non-energy sector, we're talking about all of the other emissions that aren't related to direct energy use. So not the transportation, building, energy, or electricity sector. So that includes agricultural emissions, industrial process emissions, waste emissions from both wastewater and solid waste, and in our inventory includes emissions primarily from the transmission and distribution of natural gas, but the building energy group has agreed to have that be part of their work since it's a direct link there. It's a marginal amount of emissions anyways. So we have primarily looked, as a reminder, we've looked at emissions reductions from wastewater treatment facilities, primarily in the waste sector, as we have seen great progress in the solid waste sector as a whole. We are seeking emissions reductions through industrial process emissions, which primarily come in two forms: the use of ozone depleting substitutes, so ODS substitutes, which are primarily used in refrigerant management and a few other things, but the refrigerant management is the kind of key piece there. The other major source in our industrial processes is around the emissions from our single chip fabrication plant, called Foundries in Essex, where the chemicals they use to create microchips are a fairly significant source of emissions of high global warming potential substances. So let me pull these up. I'm going to run down. I'm going to do them efficiently since some of them replicate and work with themselves. I'm going to try to make this the most of it, try to make it all visible. It might make it somewhat small, but we're going to share all these around. So I'd rather have you focus on my words than on the words on the page at this point. Let me pull up that document. Okay. I hope you can all, I'm going to move you to a place where I can see the document. So our first set of emissions reductions potential come from the wastewater treatment facility world, where primarily the issues are around reducing emissions from reducing methane emissions through both the aerobic digestion of waste and the anaerobic digestion of waste. We have some systems that have anaerobic digesters on them. Some of those systems have existing flares that burn the methane and therefore convert what would be high global warming potential methane releases into carbon dioxide emissions, which is significantly lessened. Some have beneficially reused that methane, but not all of them do. So that would be for the production of electricity to support those facilities. So we'd like to see additional work to in wastewater treatment facilities to address those issues, both in the creation of additional anaerobic digestion capacity, the functionality of flare systems, and looking at the beneficial reuse of that methane going forward. So our actions work towards gathering the information necessary to understand where we are, working towards a series of solution sets across the various wastewater treatment facilities. And then moving on there, additionally, in the sort of related electricity sector component, we believe there's an opportunity to do better energy management at wastewater treatment facilities. So our sort of strategy 6 is, and the actions that are really around doing some pretty deep energy audits at the wastewater treatment facilities that haven't done them, and figure out ways to invest in those facilities to right-size pumps and other things. For those who aren't aware, a wastewater treatment facility typically represents the largest energy use in a community, and so there's a great opportunity here to make progress towards electricity use in a community and make it cheaper for residents as well. Similarly, wastewater treatment, oftentimes we transport the residuals, what's left, the solid, semi-solid waste associated with that is often mostly water weight, and creates a significant amount of volume for transportation to its final resting place. And so there's an opportunity to, again, to continue to look at more dewatering facilities and capacities to make the transportation of that waste more efficient ultimately. So those are sort of ancillary components that we didn't want to miss the opportunity, because they kind of speak to the whole process. Then we get into the ODS substitutes component, and our goal here is really to reduce leakage of HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, from refrigeration systems in Vermont. And we get to that by looking at potentially a refrigerant management program, similar to what California has implemented, other states are considering, looking at the idea of leak detection systems in refrigeration systems of a certain size, really watching where EPA is going on a number of changes related to the Clean Air Act and work there, and then further investigate what components of California's model would make sense here in Vermont. This is a relatively new area of action, and one in which additional work is needed before we have fully concrete steps in all veins. And then again, this is the looking at the end of life emissions from HFCs from refrigeration. The idea of a extended producer responsibility has been pursued in some places, whereby helping to have those producers of the refrigerants be on the hook for managing the end of life use of those refrigerants, so that we can make sure that they're not ending up being released in the environment. We have similar systems for batteries and paint and other things to help manage the end of life care of those, so that they don't end up in improper waste streams. But so that's an opportunity, lots of education and outreach opportunity, and looking at the refrigerant recovery components. And then there's the use of HFCs as refrigerants, period. There are new models for refrigeration that don't involve the use of global warming potential HFCs. And we'd like to continue to explore what possibilities there are for replacement of those high global warming potential systems with newer systems that some of them use different models, including carbon dioxide and other things. So there are ways to get to our refrigeration needs without using HFCs. So we'd like to continue to explore that. And then finally, the last action is one we talked a little bit about a few weeks ago when we were kind of talking about our complicated situations. I mentioned to you all that Global Foundries is our only semiconductor manufacturer. That sector of the industrial processes is accountable for something like a third of our overall emissions from that sector. They didn't use the high global warming potential chemicals in their processes prior to 1990, and so their baseline in 1990 is 0, which presents some complications in the out years in terms of how we measure their success. But there is an opportunity to through what's happening now at the PUC. So the Public Utility Commission is evaluating a proposal by Global Foundries to be regulated as a self-managed utility. Under that process, the Public Service Department, primarily Ed McNamara, I'm not sure if he's on, has proposed the idea of, rather than being subject to the renewable energy standard, having all of Global Foundries emissions be covered under a commitment to reduce their overall emissions. So their electricity emissions, their thermal emissions, and their process emissions would be seeking to reduce those to levels comparable to the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so we think that's the best path forward, but we are open to sort of other ideas if that doesn't occur in terms of how we might, or if the commitments through that process are insufficient to guarantee that we're going to meet the reduction requirements, pursuing additional actions as needed. And so that represents the suite of actions under the non-energy sector. I will note that you are not seeing the agricultural components because that is being worked very, very diligently by the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee, and we can find a time to share those with you all. But I wanted to make sure that we're clear that those are being worked by a different subcommittee to ensure that they're integrated with the rest of the work that committee is doing in the agricultural space. With that, I'm happy to answer questions. I know that was a lot.
Peter, thanks very much. I see Chris has a question.
Peter, where is land use generally going to fit into this?
So one of the things that we've been talking about is the idea of thinking about, there are land use components in sort of land use as a concept from a emission standpoint is really it shows up in the transportation sector primarily, right? And so some of our solutions in the transportation sector might be land use based. We'd like to figure out how there are also land use based actions for resilience and for sequestration. And does it make sense? And this is a discussion point in terms of pulling those into one so that we track them each individually, but then there's a section of the plan that sort of talks about that in full. Because as we've discussed, I have a concern that if we focus too much on the sort of the technologies that are available to help us meet our goals in the short term, we will not set ourselves up for success in the long term in terms of land use activity needs to occur. So that's kind of the current thought process, Chris. I'm not sure if that helps, but there are no direct land use related emissions in the non-energy sectors, if that makes sense.
And Peter, just where the similar conversations happening about land use what you said makes sense. Where are those conversations happening as far as like between rural resilience and emissions and transportation?
So I think Jane organized a conversation with a few of us to think about it, whether it made sense and how we might do that. It's still in early stages, and I think it obviously needs to come through as a concept, and then needs to come back through the traditional paths of the council, jury committee, what have you. But certainly it would be my hope that we could get support from the council as a whole to pull that out as a separate piece. Jane, I'll let you speak more to it.
Yeah, so Marion and I had follow-up items around the land use meeting, and then decided to hold off because of the process that was moving afoot around the CAP drafting process, and wanted to let that play out to allow that group to come together first to think about how we manage cross-cutting issues. And the first and foremost and most important probably that we have attention to is around land use. Since things are evolving around the CAP drafting this week, land use is something we intend to speak to as a component of the proposal and process that we put forward on Tuesday to the council, and thinking about how we deal with it across the 3 subcommittees that are working on it.
Further questions for Peter? So Peter, with respect to global foundries, I mean, what I've just heard is that this proposal for them to become a self-managed utility is somehow going to be the strategy that, or are we just waiting to hear whether that happens so that we could then say, we think that the reductions we need will be on track? Just not quite sure how a proceeding before the PUC is a strategy for the Climate Council.
Yeah, that's fair, and it's frankly a bit of a timing issue more than anything else. I think if we had the results of that proceeding now, that was a commitment to the reduction of emissions across all of their emissions profile, commensurate with the Global Warming Solutions Act, that it would be easy to say, yes, that makes sense. We're not to that point yet. And so my interest is ensuring that if we don't have those addressed there, that we work to address them through the climate action plan. And so I think we will have more information in the next month or so as that proceeding proceeds.
Okay, and do you know whether in that proceeding, Global Foundries will be making representations as to how their total facility emissions can be measured so as to be in compliance with the reduction schedule?
Yeah, so I mean, we have pretty good numbers, and we're working through that with them to lock this down in terms of the 3 sources of their emissions, right? Their electricity use, their thermal fuel use, and then their process emissions. And we have a good sense of what those are and are working to lock down those numbers so that everybody's firm in what they are. The process side is about 70% of their overall emissions, though. And so that's where the greatest liability and the greatest opportunity probably rests for them.
Okay, thanks. So it's, I mean, for us right now, it's a little bit of wait and we'll see. Is that right?
I would ask for another, obviously this may not be ready precisely in time for our presentation to the council on the 12th, but I would present it in such a way that that we reflected that that's, if this were to occur, it would be a good path. However, we want to make sure that we have a backup plan in place, and we're working through those conversations.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And anything further for Peter? Thanks, Peter.
I'm grateful for the time. As a reminder, I'm going to be getting on the road, Richard, so I may pop in and off, unfortunately, but I will do my best to stay engaged.
Okay, thank you. Next up is transportation.
Well, before Peter goes, I was going to ask and beg for his support in helping us wrestle with the unwieldy template, because I do appreciate that Peter did infill the template. And as you will see, Gina and I took a stab at that, but we are a little, it's more bare bones that we would like at this moment. So we're looking forward to a conversation and a process to fill that out. And Peter, nicely done. Kudos to you.
It helped that we did it the first time.
We did.
I'll tell you something, our actions are very complicated. It's not just one entity we're regulating, it's how we move around. So the policies and the recommendations are not fully gelled. And if we distill them down to a paragraph in a spreadsheet, it lends to a lot of confusion in the discussion. That's the challenge we're having from my perspective. We have a really good list of actions. We have a list of pathways that we presented at the transportation workshop. We have a list of strategies we presented at the transportation workshop. Those have not changed. They can be put into the spreadsheet at the appropriate moment by the person who has the Excel skills that we don't have. Then we have a list of strategies that we really want to focus on today, because we need as much feedback as we can on that list of actions, excuse me, not strategies, of actions.
Mm-hmm. And so, go ahead.
Before we move forward, I just want to do a quick clarifying thing before we lose Peter. Peter, I think you referenced an October 12th meeting of the council at which these strategies would be presented. My understanding from Jane is that's October 5th, just so we're all on the same page.
I think I misspoke. I apologize.
Actions,
I like to imagine more time.
actions, not strategies. These are actions that we're going to
Yes,
present.
yes.
We are presenting actions, yes.
Yes.
Just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page about the date.
So do we want to go through the template, or just we want to go to our list of actions?
I want to start first with the list of actions and
Okay.
just beg your forgiveness for not like filling out the template. It was like, again, it is template. It was incredibly unwieldy. I couldn't get it in there. It's a lot. And we have another template with a lot of the same information. So I want to step back on process and at the same time share with you the distilled set of like 12 actions that we want your feedback on in this moment. It is in a narrative form. It is not in a tidy template, but we will get there with some support and help. So again, just to step back to say, we've been on a very similar pathway when it comes to the pathways that we've identified and the strategies that we've identified. And just as a reminder, high level, vehicle electrification, vehicle efficiency, improving vehicle efficiency of existing fleets, transportation system efficiency, which really speaks to transportation demand management strategies like transit, microtransit, bike ped, carpooling, van pooling, ride sharing, all of those things. Land use and smart growth, really looking forward to that conversation. It's a critical component that we have identified as well, and syncing up all of these efforts. And then we too have identified some other necessary, what we think are enabling strategies and actions that we would like to pursue. So that just sort of step back, like general framework for the work that we have pursued with a lot of stakeholder engagement and stakeholder input, and looking forward to these being out there for public engagement and input in the coming weeks. So Jane, can I share my screen and Gina and I can sort of walk through these, again, narrative form action?
While you're doing that, Gina, let me just say, it's fine to go through it this way. The template can come later after we discuss what should be in the template. So you don't have to apologize for.
I know, well, we were given a task and we fell short of that task, but I would also just say, and I appreciate that, Richard, that, part of what we were putting forward in terms of these initial recommended actions is really building off of, EAN's work in terms of the strategies that they have identified to get us on this pathway. And so we're trying to like sync all of this up together. If someone doesn't mind just muting their phone, that'd be great. Okay. So transportation actions. I think maybe I'll go through this, Gina, and then pivot in. We've identified 12.
Can I just back up and say, if it would be helpful to the template lovers, we can talk about which pathways these are connected to, if that would help the conversation. So there's an EV, there's an electrification pathway, there's an efficiency pathway, there's a reduction in VMT pathway, both VTrans programs and land use. And if that would help people understand our thinking, we can connect those as we walk through. I'm just throwing that out there.
Okay, thanks. And Joey, can you make the text bigger on your screen? I mean, I know we can do it on our screens too.
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, that's fine.
So Joey, why don't you go through each one and then I'll make a few comments after you finish each one, okay?
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
So recognizing the transformation that we need to undertake, our recommendations, not rocket science, we need to maximize existing revenues, existing transportation T-bill dollars. We need to seize the moment in time with these American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and then get us ready for potential federal infrastructure dollars. And really directing those investments to set the stage for building the system that we need for 21st century efficient transportation network. So things like prioritizing electric vehicle charging and other critical investments to reduce transportation emissions, and we can get into more specificity, but really using existing revenues, knowing that this is going to require funding. And in those dollar allocations, prioritizing low income, rural, underserved, and overburdened Vermonters in the programs that those dollars would support. Gina?
Yeah, so this is, we're a little uncertain about where funding goes. In the steering committee meeting the other day, it's huge in my mind. How are we going to pay for this stuff? And does that show up as an action? Or is that going to be somewhere else in the deliberations? I mean, we put this in here because we just feel it's really important. We're connecting it to electrification at this point and all those strategies around charging. But I think the council's got to have a larger conversation. I mean, and we'll get into this with TCI too, because that's another funding mechanism, among other things. So do we have this conversation now or another time? Does the council deal with, how does the council deal with money and all the stuff? Nowhere on the template is there a place to talk about how the heck are we going to pay for it? So we put it in for now in our list of actions.
It's Peter, we've talked about this a bunch. We are not including that as an action because we are waiting to see what actions we deem necessary, and then we're going to talk about a funding package as a whole. And that's been the decision point throughout.
Okay, so we're interested in seeing funding spent on charging in transportation electrification programs. So we're putting our oar in the water on that.
But your action here is an investment in those things.
Yes, in prioritizing EV charging and other critical investments to transport.
Correct.
Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Next one.
Well, and I would also just note too, and we can share this in following up, really leaning in towards the EAN numbers related to, like, for example, identifying electric vehicles, like, 47,000 electric vehicles by 2025, 1 in 4 Vermonters who make that commitment annually for the next 4 years. One of those needs to be an electric vehicle. And we think some of these dollars should go to support those programs and other programs too, which we'll get into. Second recommendation, targeting federal infrastructure investment if it comes down, and other ARPA dollars to really invest in the kinds of services we're going to need to build compact community centers, including wastewater, water, multimodal transportation infrastructure, getting at the land use and smart growth investments that are going to be fundamentally required, especially to get to 2050.
And coming out of, on number 2, which is if you will, smart growth action, coming out of the land use meeting we had, I was under the impression, and maybe I'm incorrect on this, that the resilience team, which includes several planners, was going to be taking the lead on putting a program, a suite of actions together on smart growth. So we have not delved into a lot of that detail with that understanding, my understanding anyway. So Go on. But we felt we've heard this from so many people that we feel like it needs to be in our action list.
And part of that broader conversation that Chris Campany just, noted that we look forward to having. So strategy action number 3, join the TCI program, and the 3 other states in Washington, DC, who are participating in TCI. So joining the official program, and at the same time, enacting a further complementary policy and process that goes further than the MOU and ensuring equity outcomes. And then we just have some ideas on what that would look like, but it would be premised upon a process that would, again, go further and making sure that this program prioritizes through the estimated $20 million of annual revenue it would raise, supporting and expanding programs and serving more low-income, rural, overburdened, and underserved communities in particular. So joining TCIP and enacting a complementary policy.
And this is with the understanding that the cap is not going to get us to the Vermont goals. We're going to need more policies, but at least it starts to get us there, as well as bringing in revenue.
And to remind folks, I think we've heard before that the cap, the program itself, would get approximately about 30% of emissions reductions in the transportation sector by 2032. So to Gina's point, it is, it's insufficient, but it would be a tool in the toolbox, and it would raise, again, about approximately $20 million in annual revenues to expand the programs that we hope to prioritize, in particular for low-income, rural, overburdened communities. 4, expand the EV charging programs. Again, that would need dollars, but determining what that looks like strategically in terms of the makeup and the sort of shape of those purchase and incentive programs, as well as for charging programs. But really thinking about and prioritizing multifamily needs, workplace charging, potentially public charging, and using those federal dollars, as we noted earlier, very strategically. And that will be in part informed by the analysis that is happening with our consultants simultaneously in this process. Gina, anything to add?
Nope, that's good.
Adopting California's more stringent motor vehicle emission standards, again, in lieu of defaulting to the federal standards. So this includes future amendments for the low emission vehicle program, the zero emission vehicle program, which regulates light duty, medium duty is applicable, to reduce criteria pollutants, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So this program really critical to delivering and accelerating the sale of low and zero emission vehicles in Vermont. And then sort of adjacent to, but really essential to, is number 6, adopting the California emission standards, including the advanced clean trucks and low NOx omnibus regulations. Again, to really promote and accelerate the large scale production of zero emission trucks, and really sort of sending that signal to and the required partnership of our manufacturers to deliver that kind of those kinds of clean vehicles to Vermonters. So these 2 programs are complementary, and we think fundamental to the work that we have ahead of us. Gina?
Yep.
Again, tied to what we had noted before, really prioritizing funding to expand some of the programs that are fairly new but underway now, which includes the Mileage Smart programs, the Mileage Smart program embedded within Capstone Community Action and our community action agencies, the very new Replace Your Ride program, and other programs that are really intended to help serve lower income Vermonters and moving them out of more high mileage per gallon vehicles into more fuel efficient vehicles or other transportation options. So really trying to, if we're thinking about an ecosystem of transportation services, really building on the programs that we have and identifying any other gaps that we need to fill so that we make sure that rural, lower income earning Vermonters and overburdened, underserved Vermonters can participate in these kinds of programs. So that's really important to get at the vehicle efficiency component and the transition towards 2025 and toward more clean, efficient vehicles. Gina?
Yeah, this is coming out of our pathway around overall efficiency, understanding that EV adoption in the light duty sector is where we're heading, but we still have a whole lot of vehicles on the road. And we want to try to get people into more efficient vehicles in the interim, not to detract from the need for everybody to be driving an EV. But for now, we need to at least move our way up into more efficient fossil fuel powered vehicles.
Mhm. Number 8, design and implement a vehicle efficiency price adjustment, otherwise known as potentially true cost pricing or some sort of a fee-based program that would be linked to new vehicle purchases within customer classes. So, you know, for light duty vehicles, for trucks, those sort of things, so that when Vermonters who have the income to avail themselves of new vehicles, this would be a true cost price at the time of sale to incent more clean electric vehicles. Primarily, we would recommend, as this program is being developed and it has been considered, really a thoughtful analysis and related to income sensitivity and some potential, way to address vehicles that Vermonters use for business purposes. The goal is not to, this is what we're all talking about here, is making a transition away from sort of business as usual for a variety of different reasons, and helping Vermonters in this transition move into more clean, affordable, efficient vehicles. This is one program that we have identified as important. Gina?
Yep, good.
So do you want to talk about these next two in particular? Gina?
Sure. We've heard a lot from people about how we need to increase transit, particularly in the low and moderate income area. And we heard from VTrans, we heard from the transit director, they've done some studies to get to a Western Europe standard of transit. We would have to spend 10 times per person what we're spending now. So in our opinion, now's the time to start planning towards that build out. And it will take many years, but in the meanwhile, let's start looking at it and seeing how it's going to work and how we're going to pay for it. It's the beginning of a transit program that is focused on really getting people out of their cars, to the extent that makes sense. Anything else, Joey?
Nope. Number 10.
Yeah, and 10 is, this is looking at the way the state is now doing transportation planning and really focusing on a sustainable transportation implementation plan. So we are going to identify the VMT benefits of smart growth at a Vermont scale, which some of us have been talking about, and that extends beyond the window that we have with our consultants. It's going to go into next year. We're going to set VMT targets linked to the state climate goals and requirements, and then link funding and regulatory programs to those VMT goals, goals. Then we're going to and link our investments to those goals. And then we're going to determine the funds and other resources necessary for all communities to be empowered to create and implement sustainable transportation plans. So right now, the regions outside of Chittenden County, the regions and the towns do transportation planning, but it's strictly around roads and bridges. It doesn't talk about that. Communities are not empowered with information on how to locate charging stations, how to build bike ped facilities, how to improve intersections so they're safer for bike ped. This would build a program similar to what's now called the TPI program, but it would focus on sustainable transportation implementation, because a lot of that decision making goes on at the local level.
I'm going to just move us forward because I really am looking forward to feedback. The last two, I think it has been a clear recognition for us and for others in the conversations we've been having for the last several months and beyond, really the needing to invest in the governmental and community partner capacity to execute these programs and support, Vermonters and Vermont municipalities, as Gina just articulated, and, accessing funds and implementing programs and policies. And one of the things that we thought was also important as like setting a tone and setting in, operationalizing coordination within state government is really identifying, sort of a particular person within the executive branch to lead the interagency coordination on all of this work and make sure these endeavors are syncing up to the best of our ability.
This is what the Biden administration has done, and that is they've created this person at the top level who takes on this interagency role and has the ability to get the agencies to work together.
And then lastly, looking for input from you all, really sort of recognizing the need to sort of clean up our existing fuel supply. So really sort of assessing the role, costs, benefits of a potential low carbon fuel standard. What's its feasibility and what could a potential program look like for Vermont and or regionally? So how do we, again, this whole suite of recommended actions is a compendium of different strategies that are intended to, accelerate us towards more clean vehicles. If we have to rely on them, especially for the short term, clean up our existing fuel supply, help Vermonters, invest in more sort of efficient vehicles and transportation options to get them where they need to go. And then setting the stage for the longer term, land use and smart growth strategies and investments that many of us have highlighted that are really fundamental.
And 12 is a connection to the heavy duty sector because it's finding greener or cleaner fuels in the heavy duty sector. That's where biodiesel would come in, or propane and renewably produced propane and other fuels.
So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I have shared these, albeit I'm late. Sorry, Jane, with you, and you can share with others. And really look forward to people's input and feedback.
And thank you, Chris, for what you've written in the chat.
So questions, comments? I do have and maybe this will depend on the analysis that we're going to be getting from the consultants, but it would seem to me to be important to assess these different strategies in part according to their emission reduction potential by 2025, 2030, 2050, et cetera. Some of them are likely, to produce benefits rather quickly. Others are likely to reduce smaller benefits in the near term, and they aren't really going to really scale until much later. So do you have that in mind as just part of the portfolio that you'd like to present?
I mean, anything that's related to electrification, is going to probably score fairly high based on my understanding of the work that's going on. So that's one thing. We do have to, and we have to have equity though baked into this as well as those emissions reductions. So I view those two things sort of in sync with each other. So it makes programs like Replace Your Ride and Mileage Smart, maybe they're not going to come up that big in terms of emissions right now, but over time they will, and they have a huge equity aspect to them. So it's going to be a balancing act.
Mm-hmm. I just want to, yes, underscore that. And hearkening back to several meetings ago now, yes, we had really identified, again, building off of EAN's collaborative work, the identification of vehicle electrification and vehicle efficiency as like, in terms of getting us to 2025, really key short-term strategies and investments. But then also doing what we can right now to set the stage for the longer term investments and strategies. Samson. Sorry. My dog just decides to eat right now and he's really loud.
I
Sorry.
thought it was your kid.
Yeah, well, she's home too. Yay. good for
Sorry.
her.
Just kidding.
So anyway, so we have really identified that, and your point is well taken, and that will show up, I think, in the template when we wrestle it to the ground.
I'm looking for hands from others. Oh, Chris, you're next.
So yeah, put my comment in the chat. Happy to talk about that further. I'll just give you context though. In a lot of downtowns and villages, you don't necessarily have the space for growth for the housing that we're going to need. So like Brattleboro, I should just say this is a draft housing assessment. They're going to need, like, to meet current anticipated demand, at least 700 more units. And so that's likely going to be in other neighborhoods outside of the downtown, but still within a neighborhood context. And I'm specifically working like with on the redevelopment of the old Austin school to, like, how do you put housing there? And so that would then be a new neighborhood adjoining other neighborhoods, but it would be absolutely smart growth. And then also, I'm just telling this to the rest of the group in case it sounds like heresy. The other thing too is we have areas that are like village adjacent, downtown adjacent, that could be redeveloped to provide housing. And oftentimes these are places that are outside of, since so many of our villages and downtowns, especially in our corner of the state, are located in floodplains and river corridors. You have the opportunity to develop that new housing outside of that. So that's the reason why I'm arguing that would make the case for expanding that, but still tying it to smart growth principles. Two other just quick points. I may have missed this. You guys did a great job. I may have missed this when I was putting that stuff in the chat. This would be a cross-cutting issue with the building sector and electrical sector. I know you guys have heard me talk about, I think most people will be charging EVs at home. And say you've got a 40 amp charger that you want to put in. Electrical code requires that the circuit be rated 25% above the rated charge of your charger. So that would require a 50 amp circuit. So if you've got only 100 amp service to your house and you're running all of your other electrical on 100 amp service, we're going to have to address that piece to get the EV use up, because it's not necessarily charging in downtowns and villages. It's going to happen. It's primarily going to happen at home. So you guys may have had that. I may have missed it, but that'll be a cross-cutting issues with buildings. They've talked about electric building code, and then also with electrical. I know Liz Miller has talked about, like, maybe the need for just like we have efficiency utilities, having like an electrical, changeover utility or something. And last but not least, I'm not sure exactly where this fits, but I think it's going to be necessary on the transportation side. And this goes back to the, like, resourcing RPCs and other groups. We're going to have to focus more on, like, the physical design and physical planning of our compact settlements, not just conventional town planning, but actually doing the physical design to figure out where do the roads run, where do the sidewalks run, where's the water and sewer run, where's the housing going to be, where's the new commercial. So as opposed to what typically happens with a lot of planning commissions, where you just have kind of the language, yes, we want compact settlement, we were going to develop around our village center or whatever. We really need to invest in actually the physical design of where our compact settlements are going to be and what's going to be there, because that'll help inform a lot of other things that we need to start planning to invest in. That'll particularly help inform capital investment planning at the local level, but even frankly for a state as small as Vermont, statewide capital improvement planning. So I'll hush up.
Yeah, Chris Cochran and Bronwyn Cook are very much involved now with resilience planning, and we're looking to them to put meat on the bones of our statements about smart growth, both, goals as well as specific program recommendations. We started down that road, and then it was like, let's have them do it. So they need to hear from you. You should get involved to this infrastructure group. Smart growth group. But that's where I see those actions coming out of, the kinds of stuff you would so beautifully just described.
And
So
I just,
can I?
oh, really quickly before Peter, we pivot, I just want to thank Chris for his really thoughtful comments. I think your note about readying, homes and buildings for the type of service that they're going to need for charging it was not on that list. It needs to be on that list. Thank you. Exactly what that looks like in terms of a short-term action. I look forward to brainstorming with Liz Miller, who I know has brought this up quite a bit as well, and others. And then, yes, to your other comments, I also very much appreciate, and I do think that our recognition, and I think the generally shared recognition of investing more in people power to make this happen, especially at RPCs, I think is also will be fundamentally. Sorry to interrupt you, Peter. Go ahead.
Peter?
Yeah, sorry, I can't raise my hand. I wonder, so I would encourage, for Gina and Joy, I would encourage you to continue to flesh out your ideas relative to smart growth. Because it wasn't my understanding that Bronwyn and Chris were going to take those over entirely. It was more about thinking about how do we roll that up for the cap in terms of all the areas in which land use comes into play. So I would encourage you to continue to flesh those out, and I'm happy to further discuss that offline. I just wanted to flag that I think I heard it slightly differently than you did.
Okay, so we're gonna need them to help us because we could come up with a whole bunch of crazy ideas, and they know so much about what's going on now, as do the RPC directors. So we'll do that, but I'd like it to be a dialogue with ACCD and
of course.
VACTA.
I didn't want you to think that there was a full handoff.
That they were doing it. Yeah, okay. That was maybe wishful thinking on my part. Okay.
Jane, do you have a comment or an answer on that one? Good. Let's see your hand.
Yeah. So the next steps associated with after that land use meeting was that to ensure that the substantive conversations around land use and policy recommendations really stayed with the subcommittees that were primarily tasked with that responsibility. So again, not trying to take the work out of the subcommittee, and create a new committee, but really keeping it where it was. And what I actually took away from that was a recognition that land use and smart growth is a primary pathway, primary strategy in the rural resilience and ag and ecosystem subcommittees. And it is a primary pathway, albeit not in the short term, for transportation. And so I actually, the intent was to pull us back together as a group, but as ag and eco and rural resilience were tagging their strategies that had to do with land use so that we could ensure that we're pulling it all together in a process in the cap that speaks to the benefits of it from an emissions reductions component, but also resilience, adaptation, and sequestration benefits. And so I actually think we probably just need to talk about this a bit more offline, but actually don't think Gina and Joey need to sort of continue to flesh out those strategies, that what we need to do is build confidence that the strategies where they're being developed will speak back to the benefits that they have with respect to emissions reductions and transportation.
Okay. So at the risk of being somewhat heretical, let me ask you guys a question. And I have been a smart growth proponent for my entire career, of 40 years at least. But here's an analogy for you. As the electricity system has gotten cleaner, electrification of end uses seems like it's consistent, seems as though it will be consistent with the global warming's pathway. And similarly, as transportation gets cleaner, either through electrification or through a low carbon fuel standard, why is smart growth essential? The Vermont historic patterns of development are what they are. People live where they live. If they're driving clean cars, they're not emitting. So I'm just pushing, I'm being heretical on purpose, but I really am pushing the question in terms of priorities for climate purposes. It looks like your hand's up, Gina. You have an
Rich, I
answer.
wish we could drive our way out of this problem. I don't think we can, because our communities are going to suffer immensely. With all the cars, we have to start thinking about the movement of people and goods out of a transportation option that isn't a vehicle, because of health issues, because of community character, because of livability, all those issues, because of the metals we have to dig up for these batteries. We just can't think that we can still keep living the car-centric lives we live and just substitute that with an electric car. It's very short-sighted and will just add to a whole bunch of other problems, in my humble opinion. And others have written about this, and I can send you the articles.
I don't disagree with you on all the co-benefits of smart growth. I'm just asking us to have an answer to the question, why does the climate plan focused on reducing emissions need to address all those other points you just raised?
Because of equity, because of quality of life, because you could argue the source of the batteries and the manufacturing of all those vehicles. I know, to the extent that we look outside the state's borders, I mean, I think that's an issue. I mean, if you look at VMT in a normal scenario, it's just going to go up and up and up. A business as usual scenario. And I would consider this kind of business as usual. Maybe those are secondary impacts, but I just don't think we're going to prevail if we simply say, let's just drive our way out of this problem, only switch over the power source to electricity.
So Richard, I appreciate the question, because I agree it is something we're going to be asked to answer, although I do think it is coming up as such a primary thing, because land use addresses many other needs and it has many other benefits. If we're talking about the work happening in ag and ecosystems, for example, like making sure that we are supporting our farmers and our foresters who provide a lot of really important benefits, including an increasing need to feed more Vermonters with more local food so that we can stop, importing stuff from far-flung locations. And that will require really protecting those resources and enabling our, agricultural entrepreneurs to survive and thrive in support of that really important goal. So, and I also just think as Vermont becomes more of an epicenter for people looking to get away from, wildfires, drought, other impacts of the warming world, we're going to see an influx of climate migrants that, we need to be ready to invite them into our state and make sure that we're, we have land use strategies that invite them into places where we really want to prioritize growth and development. Because I agree with Gina, we can't drive ourselves out of this problem. At the same time, I do want to underscore when it comes to sort of short-term strategies, we'll put the numbers behind it, leaning in on the EAN data, but like vehicle electrification and vehicle efficiency as sort of shorter term greenhouse gas emission reductions, recognizing that not everyone's gonna, get out of their cars or have the ability to give out of their cars, or certainly not live off grid. Like, we're gonna need to invest in this transition, and that requires more clean, efficient vehicles and making them accessible.
Another thing is, from a transportation perspective, with rising VMT, you get congestion. With congestion, you have to spend money on roads and bridges and intersections, build new interstate interchanges. That's all going to take money away from the sustainable transportation goal that we want set. You can't just increase the number of cars without paying a big price in terms of transportation funding.
Mhm.
That's been shown for years now. More cars, more investment in roadways because of safety and because of congestion. And then you get into pollution. Although I guess if everyone's driving an electric car and an electric truck, it's not such an issue. But I think the diesel side is a long way off in terms of
So,
electrification.
I'm not really,
Thanks for allowing me to raise the question. And this is a long conversation. We do have to be prepared.
Oh, I know.
to
We have to,
answer
from
them.
both sides on this, from both
Okay.
sides.
and I think there will be a tension potentially at some point about, with limited resources, where do we prioritize them now? Where do we prioritize them next year? You know, like, so we need to be thinking about that. So I appreciate the question. And I think it's like, we put forward a suite of strategies that we think are important, and they need to be stepped, and they need to be grounded in, you know, the cost effectiveness is, as Jared just laid out in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. That's like our primary charge in this work. It's not the singular charge, but it's a big one. A couple of things I just want to note. Again, I'm not really sure how much time we have, although I do see.
You are well over your time at the moment.
I know, but Ed and Liz aren't here, as Jane said. So two
Jane
other
says.
things.
Okay, keep going, Joey. Keep going.
I want to thank Chris for his offer of the RPCs as an incredible resource to lean into when it comes to the land use and smart growth strategies. And however that happens, we may avail ourselves of that opportunity. And then I guess one thing I just want to ask is, we sort of laid out these recommended actions that have been informed, not just through our deep work over the last 9 months, but through like literally decades of work and public engagement and process and thinking. We put these forward as sort of actionable opportunities that we see. And I just really want to ask the question, what's missing? And are there deep concerns about any of these things? I just want to ground truth that with this team, like, to hear from you, so that we have, we have solidarity going into a broader climate council conversation, tackling 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions in this transportation work. You love it and we're done? Awesome.
It's a pretty comprehensive list. So
And we will whittle based on further metrics and analysis in the work with our consultants to really, get at more of the measurable and like, so we can really prioritize and step this process. But we think we wanted to put this forward as what we hoped would be a fairly comprehensive suite of actions.
all right, thanks so much. I think we should turn to buildings.
Great, thank you, Richard. Hope you all can hear me okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. Christine Donovan and Brian Woods recently from A&R have been helping put together these recommendations. These approaches for buildings we've discussed with this subcommittee already a number of times. Very broadly speaking, they've grown out of work that EAN has been doing in the process of putting this into a template form. We're in that process now. Joey explained all the great things about the template, and I'm not going to go into them. We're in the process of doing that, and we'll continue to incorporate insights into that. We're meeting right after this meeting with the consultants who are going to put a sharper point on some of the things I will be talking about, and hopefully help us better understand how suitable these approaches that I'm going to talk about actually are. In general, as far as principles go, Joey just articulated them. It's dollars per ton and equity. That's how I think of it in a short form. The two recommendations I'm going to be talking about are suites of actions. The first one is weatherization, has been called weatherization at scale. And the second is clean heat standard. The weatherization at scale effort is looking at a number of different topics. The first and the most important one is funding. Vermont happens to have all sorts of know-how when it comes to weatherization. Lots of experience, very knowledgeable folks. Scaling it up to the levels that we need to meet these requirements is the challenge. So funding is part of that. Financing is another. Tariff on bill financing is one of the elements that we're looking at. Workforce development, we need people to be able to deliver this, is another. Consumer financial counseling, understanding, for people to understand precisely what it is they might invest in or they might seek to get rebates for and invest in partially, we think is very important. So that element of education. Another piece of this is something I call a rental efficiency standard. And it's basically a fairly long-term approach where you get support for landlords to bring their rental properties up to a minimum standard of efficiency. And all of this needs to ensure, we need to ensure that this happens in a way that supports low and moderate income folks. And we think that the focus on renters is really important there, as well as overburdened and underserved communities. And we're endeavoring to understand what, in fact, that means here in Vermont. So that's weatherization at scale. The second suite of approaches is referred to as a clean heat standard. Clean heat standard is an RPS-like program for fossil fuel delivery companies, Vermont Gas Systems, other delivered fuels. What it's going to do is, it's a performance standard, so it provides these folks different ways of complying with requirements. Essentially, like an RPS, it's just going to be a percentage of the fuel that's delivered has to be decarbonized according to a progressive timeline. Advanced wood heat is part of this. Electrification is part of this. Other efficiency approaches are also. To ensure equity, it's really important that this approach will look at and consider carve-outs for low and moderate income folks or other worthy communities that might be adversely affected by a policy like that, if that's the case. And there's greater support for existing programs that, that deliver some of these related policies. And at the bottom of all of this, outreach is really important. We recognize that outreach is something that we need to continue to undertake. Finally, before I go into detail about these two suites of approaches here, it's really important. We don't want to, I won't go into detail about these, but there are complementary policies that are really important to making these things work. Demand response in the energy sector. All this electric load needs to be managed in a way that doesn't overburden the system unnecessarily. Yes, we'll need to build out the system to accommodate EVs and to accommodate heat pumps. But the system at this point actually could be managed to accommodate a lot more of these resources today. So managing that through demand response programs is really important. Rate design is a way of doing that. Direct load control is a good way of managing space heating, water heating, and electric vehicle charging. And efficiency program designs, we hope that those are revisited so that they can accommodate the level of undertaking that the Global Warming Solutions Act is calling for. So let's consider, let's talk about weatherization at scale. 2025 goal is 80,000 homes. 2030 goal, 148,000 homes need to be weatherized. Obviously, it's of high importance. And the actions that this involve, I will give some. It doesn't have all the actions, but increased funding. I realize funding is a separate issue, but this is in fact the crux of getting to scale. We already know how to do these things, as I pointed out. Revisiting existing weatherization programs. Are there any curbs on those existing programs that could be removed to make existing programs more effective? Federal dollars will become available, how to use those in the best way possible. RGGI proceeds are currently supporting thermal efficiency. How is that going to work? And can that be, can RGGI proceeds be increased? Can they be used differently perhaps? ISO New England Forward Capacity Market is funding thermal efficiency. In simple terms, that funding is shrinking. And so we're going to need to find other resources. Is bonding, the state's bonding authority possible there? Climate Economy Action Team suggested that. Fuel tax increase, PUC's Act 62 report mentions that. Thermal efficiency benefit charge, PUC Act 62 report mentions that. Improved financing, we talked about tariff on bill financing. In other words, instead of asking a renter to sign off on a loan to get a heat pump, let's say, would it be possible to address that investment and tie that to the meter itself? In other words, to the use of electricity on those premises. That's something that's being explored by the Weatherization at Scale group. And they're talking with utilities about potential undertakings related to this in the first and second quarters of this next year. Residential rental improvement. This is a model, it's a municipal ordinance that has been adopted in various forms around the country. Boulder, Colorado has adopted this, where in 2011 they passed authorization, and they took the next 8 years to educate landlords, to provide them with financial support, to bring their rental units up to a minimum standard. Basically, it looks like IECC 2019. So it's not a huge lift. One of the very positive results from that has been that landlords engaged in this and educated to think about this have made greater investments on their own to do this. So we think this is a worthy approach to consider. Workforce development is a big challenge here. We need the folks to deliver this. The legislature has just funded some work on studying ways to develop curricula to help the state and its schools train people up. And if the solar development that took place over the last decade or so in Vermont is any evidence, if the state's behind it, if there is opportunity there, private capital private capital got behind solar development, and it's very possible we could have the same sort of reaction with respect to weatherization. Financial counseling, I explained, and obviously outreach is at the bottom of this. The timeline has been pretty much set out as I explained. There's a huge amount of water heaters, heat pump water heaters, other sorts of efforts that need to be undertaken. That's not an example of weatherization, but basically weatherization is cost between somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000 per unit. And there's a big lift. So there's a fair bit of financing that needs to be provided. I'm going to stop right there before I go to the clean heat standard, because I don't want to run on too much. If there are questions, I will do my best to answer.
Questions for Dave? I'll ask one, Dave. Have you discussed the trigger points for the residential rental efficiency standard? Would this apply in your proposal to single units, mother-in-law apartments, et cetera, or to only to multi-unit housing projects.
Thanks for that question, Richard. You know, we haven't gotten to that level of detail except to recognize that there are different types, like you allude to. You know, there are businesses that rent to students, for example, and then there are retirees who might have an apartment that they want to let. And we recognize that this would, a program like this would have to recognize those differences, but I appreciate you bringing that up. So if there are no questions, what I'm going to do is move on to the next part of this.
Can I guess I have one more question, because we had a conversation a bit earlier about, you know, the overlap among the committees here on land use questions. And I'm going to predict that we're going to have a similar kind of overlap with respect to workforce development. That workforce is going to be an issue across sectors. And I wonder whether we should try to coordinate on that, or whether we should just bring it up each time it's relevant. And
yeah, coordination is obviously the better choice, Rich. I think, you know, Neil Lunderville is leading the weatherization at scale discussions, and he's, or anybody involved in those discussions, better suited than I to talk about the level of coordination that they've already engaged in. I suspect that they have engaged in some of those discussions, but that's a note I will make, and we should bring it up, because I think building it in up front is better than tacking it on every time it comes up.
Hey, Dave, this is Christine.
Yeah.
I actually, in response to Rich's question, I either emailed or texted Dave Farnsworth during Gina and Joey's presentation, because I suggested we add an action for consideration to appoint a person at top level of government to take an interagency approach to workforce development, modeled on the Gina and Joey recommendation for transportation, because I do think workforce development is analogous to transportation in the sense that there are many different public and private entities involved with workforce development, and an interagency cross-sector approach probably will be needed in Vermont to scale up to the way that we need to. So, I just wanted to lay that out there.
Thank you, Christine. That's a great suggestion. Are there other questions?
it looks like Peter may have a comment. Peter?
Yes.
Maybe not. Okay, Dave, just your next topic.
Okay, clean heat standard is the second part of this. And there are people on this call who have been involved more closely in discussions of the clean heat standard than I. So I look forward to you all weighing in and fleshing this out a little bit more than I may do as I go through this. So as I mentioned, this is a performance standard. It's applied on a competitively neutral basis to major suppliers of heating fuels. What it does is credit measures that directly reduce combustion in fossil fuels in Vermont homes and businesses. For instance, we're talking about getting credit for using biofuels, hydrogen, if its production is less CO2 intensive than the fuel it's displacing, electrification, heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, wood burning, advanced wood heat, so pellet stoves and the like, for commercial and residential homes, and energy efficiency. It's important to ensure equity, and as I mentioned, minimizing adverse effects that this program might produce. That carve-outs for fuel switching, for example, is support at least some low-income heat pump, pellet stove, some amount of that development for every other run-of-the-mill sort of changeover could be one way of doing it. supporting substantial low-income weatherization is also another part of that. But there are other versions of this to ensure that that this is implemented equitably. There are lots of complementary state policies associated with the clean heat standard, some of which VGS rate designs for low-income customers, enhanced, increased state low-income fuel cost assistance, statewide minimum efficiency requirements for rental properties that I just mentioned, fee bait for heating equipment, broadening the range of measures that state low-income weatherization programs promote. Not just weatherization, for example, but weatherization and renewables or weatherization and heat pumps, that sort of thing. And so when we look at this effort, a clean heat standard is currently, it's not been authorized under Vermont law. It's likely there's going to need to be legislative support for this and a legislative action. It may be that the state could proceed administratively. I haven't had this discussion with folks working on this more closely, but very likely to be a legislative undertaking. This would enable the PUC to oversee the development of this program. It would involve using the RPS Tier 3 tag process, which is technical assessment of different approaches to ensure that, in fact, reductions are occurring as being represented by these different approaches. So it would involve building on the tag process that's already in place here in Vermont. I'm just trying to get through my spreadsheet here. Apologize.
Speaking of which, were you intending to share your screen? Because you didn't.
I was not.
Okay.
No, I'm just not really good with these spreadsheets, and to share that with you would just multiply the dread. So I'm not going to do that if that's okay. But I got to say that's a really good idea if somebody has to write a gigantic report based on 6 subcommittees. So I'm not going to complain about it. I'm just not going to use it. One final observation. Is it possible to develop a clean heat standard regionally? That's a longer discussion, but it could have beneficial effects, as one might imagine, because heating fuels are produced outside of Vermont for transportation and for buildings. And the points that Gina and Joey made about this is bigger than Vermont apply here in this case. So as a regional approach to doing this worthy of consideration. I'm going to end my presentation there, but Rich, Jared, anybody else, please add more to it because it's been pretty much a thumbnail sketch.
Thanks, Dave. Are there questions for Dave about the clean heat standard? I mean, the committee has heard about it before, but I just want to make sure everybody understands functionally how it would work and what kind of resources would qualify as clean under the clean heat standard. One thing that Dave didn't mention was the possibility of district heating as a qualifying resource under a clean heat standard. And I know that that's an active conversation in Burlington right now.
I would also just note, if it's all right, Rich, briefly, and I think this applies both to a clean heat standard and a possible low carbon fuel standard on the transportation side, which was mentioned by Joey and Gina, is that the way that most of these programs have either been set up in other states, in the case of the low carbon fuel standard, California, Washington, and Oregon, or in the case of the clean heat standard, the way that it has been designed to date, is to look at the life cycle emissions of the different measures and fuels. I think that people have rightly and fairly brought up concerns about what is, especially when you look at different types of biofuels or different types of renewable natural gas, that depending on the sourcing of those fuels and the processes by which they're developed and transported, that they can have widely varying life cycle emissions factors. And so I'm really, I'll just speak for myself, very encouraged at the proposed design of low carbon fuel standards in other states and clean heat standard, that it would be looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions overall on a life cycle basis, so that we're not accidentally enabling fuels or technologies that would actually increase emissions somewhere in the supply chain.
Excellent point, Jared. And this has been a deep topic of conversation on the working group that's been developing the clean heat standard. Agree completely with you that we don't want to inadvertently promote fuels that have significant negative effects, either in life cycle carbon terms or with respect to topics like deforestation, anywhere. And so the standards for doing that through the tag process with supervision by Vermont regulators would be built right into the program. As Dave also pointed out, I think it's important that both the weatherization at scale program and the clean heat standard have built right into their architecture mechanisms to deliver benefits directly to low and moderate income Vermonters who deserve to be well treated in the design of these programs and whose participation is essential to success anyway. Anybody has questions, further questions for Dave? Dave, would the rental efficiency program that you envision, would that require state legislation, or is that something you envision individual municipalities doing on their own?
Individual municipalities are doing things sort of like that. They could do that on their own. A good part of the program, in other words, the lead up time where you're providing rebates and education to landlords, could be developed out of existing programs, arguably. That said, the state could authorize it on its own and make it, just a statewide program. So I think you have all those options, Richard.
It's really tough for most municipalities in Vermont to, they have the bandwidth to adopt a really progressive, forward-looking building code of any kind, much less to hire the staff necessary to enforce it. I think we talked about the idea of having circuit riders, perhaps working out of the regional planning commissions to assist region-wide in developing and or enforcing a standard if there were going to be one. I just don't envision individual Vermont towns doing that on their own.
Yeah, agreed.
Chris, I see you. You can chime in on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is one of the things I think we're going to need to talk about. I'm not exactly sure where it fits in the plan. Is on a lot of these is have a discussion about within the Vermont context. What does that look like? Because it could be a circuit rider housed at an RPC, or it could be, I'm thinking of like if you do have inspectors, is it better for it to be done at a state level? I don't know, but these are the kinds of questions we can ask, but they can be housed, elsewhere throughout the state. Just like we've got river engineers that serve Southeast Vermont that don't operate out of Montpelier. They live down this way. Same thing, watershed coordinators and other folk. And I think the fire inspectors operate that way too. But anyway, we should probably just plan for some discussion on the plan about, we develop these recommendations, at what level of government does it make the most practical sense to actually achieve what we're recommending? Where does it actually take most to take effect? Because one of the things that I see, frequently is sometimes, there'll be a state level initiative that gets kicked down to the towns, and it's not due to lack of desire, it's not the capacity to do it, which you were just talking about, Richard. So I think there are a lot of ways to kind of get at the same end. We're just gonna have those kind of deeper governance conversations, I think.
Anything further for the buildings conversation? Thanks, Dave.
Welcome.
Jane, I think we're,
Richard,
sorry,
yeah,
Joe.
can I just ask a question about sort of process and how we as a subcommittee are gonna sort of untangle what we're laying out here and feel good about walking into a full council conversation about a shared set of priorities. I just, I think there's a lot here, and a lot of this is gonna have to be done in service of the statute and in service of our planetary obligation. So I just want to understand better the process for really feeling good about what we're collectively recommending, knowing that it would be great to have consensus as a subcommittee and aim for consensus as a council, although we may not get there, because what we're trying to do is a big heavy lift, because we've not done a lot for a long time, and we got to pivot in a big way. So I'm just trying to understand process.
So Richard, if I might jump in quickly.
Please.
So Joey, as a reminder, in terms of the next few weeks, this conversation was our initial kind of make everybody aware of the action step. Next week, we'll be getting into the equity conversation around those actions. And then the following week is when we're really having the discussion around where consensus lies and if there are challenges that we see and what we want to put forward to the council.
That is super helpful. And I appreciate that. I guess one thing I would say, to help us continue to advance our work, it would help me anyway. Like if there are any concerns, or big red flags or others, I'm very much looking forward to the conversation next week and to that lens being applied. But I also want, it would be helpful now to know so that we can think about and respond to, because I think when it comes to program and policy design, you can design programs and policies to achieve different outcomes, including equity results. And that's where I just want to make sure that we're doing, if there's any work we need to be doing between now and next week or now and the following 2 weeks, I'd love to get people's thoughts on that.
Well, certainly we need to make sure that in our description of recommended programs, that we identify the ways in which equity considerations are built in. Dave Farnsworth, a few minutes ago said, when he's looking at tons, cost per ton, and equity as the 3 criteria that can drive our thinking. And it's useful for us as the mitigation committee to be able to identify those criteria. So that's certainly one thing that comes out of this conversation. And we're hampered a bit by the fact that we are developing these ideas using some expert judgment, because we anticipate that we know where the tons are, and we know something about what things cost, and we know something about how equity can be served, but we haven't had the benefit of all of that analysis yet. And I would suggest that it will be useful when presenting ideas to the full council that we incorporate those data to the extent we can as soon as we get them. So that will enable us to sort of speak with some clarity about what things work well for 2025 and 2030, and how much they might cost, and how equity can be served. That will help the full council to understand what's on our list and why. But I think right now, I mean, Peter just pointed out, we've developed a good slate of policies to be on the menu. And now we need to do some hard thinking about how we would prioritize them for the benefit of the full council. Jared?
Thanks, Rich. I would just anticipating that next meeting that Peter just gave us a preview of. I would just note that, like, I'm just trying to think through the list of actions and how we assess them within the equity framework and the guiding principles. And there are some proposed actions that are really clear to me that they are directly designed to advance an equitable energy transition. If we talk about on the transportation side, expansion of the Mileage Smart program or the Replace Your Ride program that are targeting incentives to lower and lower middle income Vermonters, or on the building side, the weatherization at scale effort, which has primarily been developed to serve lower and lower middle income Vermonters, reduce their heating costs. But most of them, I think it's fair to say, the proposed actions that we've all gone through today, I think you can easily imagine equitable or inequitable outcomes depending on the design specifics and the details of how it gets developed and implemented that we just don't know yet. So I would just suggest there may be some of these where we haven't enough information to be able to do that equity assessment. There may be others at which it's really going to matter what the details in terms of program design and proposed implementation are to be able to do that. And the best we may be able to do at this point would be to identify kind of equity considerations in terms of, make sure if you're implementing or advancing this action that you don't do X, Y, or Z, and that you do, A, B, or C. I just want to flag that because I don't want to get into a spot where folks are frustrated that we don't yet have enough information to do a comprehensive equity assessment because we haven't seen all of the analysis. That needs to come, but not everything is yet at the place where we can do that because there's not necessarily enough detail in a lot of these actions, and the detail matters.
Jane and then Joey.
So the next thing on the agenda was to talk about prioritization, and also in the context of the next steps for the equity work that your committee will be asked to do and supported to do. So before I go into prioritization, I just teeing up this conversation, I just want to say that for the benefit of all, to make sure you all know, we have selected a consultant to support the equity work of the subcommittees, and then ultimately the council, as well as to help us think about what implementation of the guiding principles really looks like as we start to refine and really develop actions and programs and policies in the implementation phase of the climate action plan. That contractual negotiation is happening right now. And I expect them to be on board and have the contract signed in the next few days. I don't expect them to be ready to meet with your subcommittee next week, unfortunately, especially because even if they're on board and maybe they join the meeting for a portion of it, we haven't fleshed out a schedule for that person yet in their work with the subcommittees. But I expect some of the questions Jared's now raising about what actions or what things we look at as a subcommittee, what has enough detail, what doesn't. That's some of that pre-work, I think, that we'll have to bring forward to have in a public meeting will need to be done, and guidance from the consultant will need to be given to all of you in order to do that. So I really actually can't envision how that will happen before 2 weeks from now at a minimum. Unfortunately, but I do expect that person to be able to start to provide clear guidance on expectations about how they'll be able to support the work really soon. So I just wanted to put a pin in that. knowing that how anxious we are to start to have that conversation, but and excited that we have somebody on board to help facilitate that. But just know that it took a lot longer because of personal circumstances with that person to get it advanced. So just wanted to say that, and happy to talk about the other components of prioritization that we're thinking about and plan to talk with the council on Tuesday.
Thanks, Jane. And anything more about prioritization?
Happy to talk about that, but thought Joey and Gina, if their comments were related specifically to this, that I'd let them go first.
Thanks.
Yes, my comments related to that. That's great news, Jane. I look forward to that. And that was my question with a little bit more specificity about what next week will look like. So that's very helpful. And again, really good news. The other piece of it is, this is random, maybe non sequitur, but I had on my calendar from 4 to 6 tonight, a meeting with the Just Transition Subcommittee to talk about this. Is that not happening anymore?
That meeting tonight was supposed to be around, it was never actually really scheduled or put out to subcommittees or council members, but I'm sure people heard about it. But the intent of that meeting was really about the engagement work and sort of training the subcommittee and council members in delivery of the collateral materials in order to enhance additive engagement with your networks and existing meetings, and how to bring the message out to folks. And when the collateral is sort of being being reworked, redeveloped based on feedback from council members, Just Transitions, and ANR staff, because that collateral isn't ready yet. It won't be ready till Monday. Just Transitions subcommittee canceled their meeting tonight, and will rethink how and if we support subcommittee members and council members in delivery of the collateral when we meet with that group of counselors, Just Transitions reps and ANR staff on Monday. So, I'll just say that the real focus of our engagement will, from a purely capacity standpoint at this point, has got to be we have 7 events that are about to kick off, not next week, but the week after. 4 in-person events, 3 online events, and then in addition, the stakeholder engagement events that we're still doing with ag and ecosystems and rural resilience. So the capacity and shift of both our consultants and staff has been really on standing up those events, and then of course ensuring that the collateral and the delivery of the messages is where we all think it should be. And then of course supporting, putting that out there for staff and subcommittee members and council members to use. But at what scale we'll support that is sort of to be determined on Monday.
Okay, thank you. That's super helpful. I look forward to following that, seeing the more final public engagement materials. I think there was some really good stuff there. I had offered a little bit of input, and just hoping that the entire endeavor needs to be also focused in on, again, just the why we're doing this, and the deep inequities in the status quo, and the cost of business as usual. And we're in a bind because we've subsidized and externalized for a long time, and now our work is even more important. So I appreciate that update, Jane, and look forward to staying tuned to that. And thanks.
Gina, you're next.
Yeah, I just think as far as equity goes, we tried to bake it into all we were doing, with understanding that we're limited in our view and we need to have this wider airing. But I think all of us need to be thinking what all that information that's been presented to us thus far on equity is baked into our recommendations. That's number one. Number two is on cost effectiveness. We sat down with Cadmus and David Hill earlier in the week, and we went through our actions with them, and they're not going to be able to put a fine point on cost effectiveness of these things. There's some areas where they can start to get at it, but if you think we're going to have the definition of cost effectiveness from those guys, it's not coming, at least in transportation. I don't think it's coming in the next 2 weeks. So as we evaluate, we have to keep that reality in mind, which maybe you are, maybe, I thought, whoa, they're going to show us the precise number that these various actions are going to bring. And that's not what I heard, unless I was missing something in that meeting.
Gina, were they able to give you, putting aside cost effectiveness for a moment, were they able to give you any metrics on tons?
Not yet. I mean, we're expecting to see that soon, in the next couple, right, Jane? Soon. They gave us the lecture, a model's a model, and it's not the,
Right.
it's a crystal ball, and it makes crystal ball a little bit clearer, but, it's up to you guys to sort of weigh the pros and cons. So it is what it is, and we need to factor it into our evaluation with that reality in mind.
Okay. Thanks. Jane, your hand's up again? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just to point on the economics. We are having a meeting about the economic work later this week or next week. It's on the calendar, largely being requested. We were asked by JFO to understand what the economics modeling is going to tell us, what their responsibility is as Joint Fiscal Committee of assessing the cost of the climate action plan, and then further economic analysis that we intend to do through our own funding and support through our technical analyses. And so Gina is right that we're going to understand macro level economics, and I'm going to get in over my head so fast on this, so hopefully Jared and others can bail me out, but we're going to understand high level macroeconomics, but not the individual costs of each of the policies and actions that we're putting out there. And that is certainly something that we want to do further analysis on to support through technical consultants, but we will not have that for December 1st. And that's just a timing consideration. So the conversation's already starting to move in that direction to ensure that we're teeing up consultants to support that. And but Gina is right in her characterization of that we won't understand specific costs associated with specific actions.
Richard, it's Peter. Can I jump in quickly?
Please, yeah.
So I think that's a helpful framing. It's obviously the timing of the equity contractor coming on board is what it is. I would encourage us to continue forward with that conversation, because I think it's next week, and do the best we can in identifying areas either of known equity considerations or of, as Jared put it, those things we need to do or not do as we build out programs. I think would be a very, very helpful exercise, and one in which we would all benefit and help to ground our work in the just transitions principles as we go forward.
So Peter, if I can feed that back to you, make sure I heard it right. You're suggesting that even though we won't have had the hands-on assistance from the consultant before next week, that it would be useful for this committee to meet as scheduled next week to go through the suggested actions with an equity lens, and to articulate those aspects of our policy proposals that need attention with respect to equity issues, and what our plans are with respect to addressing them. Is that what you're saying? Even without the consultant's assistance, we advance our discussion on those points?
Yes, precisely.
And let me ask councilors, how do you feel about that?
Well, one thing, I was gonna say why I raised my hand is, some of this stuff we know because we've been analyzing this for a while, like in the weatherization arena, we can dust off some pretty significant analyses that show like the greenhouse gas emission benefits of it, the cost effectiveness of different programs. And like, so I think, you know, and like with the TCIP program, like we have a foundation. So there are some things that we can, that are like gonna probably be core, or I would propose our core recommendations that we advance, that I think can have answered these questions enough to know, to be able to analyze them and put them in this mix. And some of them we're going to need that further analysis. But I just, you know, I keep thinking about the reason we're operationalizing this entire endeavor is because we've dawdled for a really long time. Now we need to get serious. And so like, we need to just put forward programs and accelerate the adoption of different policies and programs so that we can actually begin to really make the kind of progress we're going to need. So I highly just recommend that we think about those things and we recognize all the work that we have done to date for a couple of different decades on some of those core components. Again, weatherization, the TCI program, and there are some other things that we can rely on in the, you know, intermediate moment until we get the fundamental information that we need to really get at further program design, program implementation, really centered around making this an equitable transition. So I just want to sort of note that seems important.
We could reassemble next week and go through basically the list of actions, but instead of describing the actions generally and broadly, discuss specifically our best ideas for advancing equitable implementation and equitable focus, and let that be our conversation for next week. That is what I think I heard Peter recommending, and that's a possibility. In the, I suppose the potential concern on the other side is that we would be having that conversation in advance, and I suppose we could say in preparation for having the guided conversations with our consultant to work through the equity principles and the rubric. So I just think there's some tension between going ahead on our own first to advance the conversation, and on the other hand, it might be desirable, in fact, to go ahead first and start making up our list of issues and questions. So other folks have thoughts on this? Jared, I know you know, this timing thing is an issue for you as well. So tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be helpful as preparation to identify some of the key questions and key design considerations that are really going to, you know, bear on, you know, to what degree the different actions center and advance kind of equitable outcomes and processes. You know, I think as an aid to that conversation, the extent to which the different task groups are able to fill in more detail, especially as would relate to kind of grounding and framing some of those conversations in the next week would be great. But I know that there's a lot going on, especially for those who are preparing for the, myself included, for the Energy Action Network Annual Summit next Wednesday. I would also just say that even though we do not yet have the full kind of economic analysis, and we will not have it in the next 2 weeks, from our consultants that are doing the LEAP modeling and associated economic analysis, you know, we're not starting from scratch in terms of questions about cost effectiveness. We do have some great resources that were developed by the Public Service Department on kind of a cost per ton avoided basis. That model was reviewed by Energy Futures Group, one of our consultants. They made some recommendations about that, but I do think that we have a good sense, generally speaking, about a number of these measures on a cost effectiveness basis. It's not 100% comprehensive. It's not, you know, perfect, but I would just remind folks, and you know, this is partially in my role as the liaison with the Science and Data Subcommittee, that we have reviewed that report from EFG. That it included a review of the Department of Public Services cost of carbon model, and some of those resources will be relevant to us. And it's not like we don't have anything to work with there.
Okay, so I think we are at time, and I should draw this conversation to a close, but the conclusion that I'm drawing from this conversation is that we should meet next week. We should focus on beginning the work on, explicitly calling out the equity components of our actions, and prepare for working with the consultant. And we should also, we'll be in a position to do follow up on the outcome of the full council meeting. Am I echoing you correctly there, Jane? Okay, so we are at time. Joey, you got something urgent?
I just want to ask it again, because I think it would be very helpful, at least for me, at some point, to get the consultant to walk us through collectively how they would apply the principles in the rubric, say to weatherization, for example. Let's do that together, a collective walkthrough, so that we can all sort of grapple with how they would recommend us applying that and thinking through it collectively.
That's very much what they're going to do when they meet with you guys. Yeah.
Right.
And you're going to be asked to consolidate a handful of things to do that with, because you won't be able to do everything, right? And then hopefully you're going to have a skill set based on the comfort level to create the transparency needed to do it yourself, because that's the benefit of it, right?
That's the plan. The problem is that won't happen before next week. So next week we're flying without that guidance in order to advance our own understanding and get prepared for that later conversation. So we are at time here, and we need to take a few moments to hear from members of the public, if there are members of the public who'd like to address the committee. I'm pausing and haven't seen any hands up or heard any voices, and so I believe we've completed our agenda and we can stand adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep.
Well.